This is Jim Savastio. I'm one of the elders of the Reformed Baptist Church of Louisville, and welcome to our podcast. I'm joined again with my friend and a member of this congregation, Jake Stone. And we've had two podcasts in which Jake has shared something of his testimony, his introduction into ministry, his transition into the doctrines of grace, and into confessional Reformed Baptist life. And 3.5 years ago, Jake, you left ministry. You resigned, I suppose, as a pastor. You entered into life as a student. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what this has been like for you, just as a man, emotionally, as a Christian, going from pulpit to pew. This is really hard for a lot of men, and I imagine you had your own set of struggles. Maybe share some of the struggles and then maybe some of the blessings and benefits that have come as you've transitioned from pulpit to pew.
It was very difficult. I pastored a church that even at kind of the height of our growth was about 50 to 60. I was the only full-time pastor. The last 5 years, there was another brother who served with me as an elder, but he was not paid, and I still did the bulk of the preaching and teaching. And so, I did the bulletins and all of that stuff. And so going from, preaching 3 times a week, preparing the bulletins, all of those things to nothing.
Hard stop.
Was a hard stop. And it was it was difficult. There were many times where I felt like I was useless, that, what was the point? And I remember realizing it took some time that my identity had become very wrapped up in that I was the pastor of this church.
Right. And now I was, even as yes, I'm a Christian, but I'm a preaching Christian. I'm a pastoring Christian, and I'm being used, and all Christians want to feel useful.
Yeah. And it was essentially like, everything that I had was essentially gone, and now I'm just me in a sense.
And you're unknown. You come in and you're known. People here don't know you really. As you first come in, obviously people slowly get to know you. People don't know. I think the first time you preached, some people were like, "Where'd that come from?" I didn't know he could do that, and didn't realize because not everybody knew your story, or maybe had read carefully your testimony when you applied to membership. So walk through that. How long did that last? And do you still struggle with that?
I think the Lord, there are still some moments where that struggle has still been there. But in His kindness, I remember when you and I had our first lunch meeting when I moved up here, I told you then that it was very weird for me because I said, I'm used to sitting where you're sitting, essentially,
Sure.
and listening to somebody who's visiting where I was pastoring and going
and
to
if you were out of the pulpit, you were only out of the pulpit for a week or two, and then you're going to be back.
Exactly.
And then you realize that this isn't at least for now, this isn't coming back.
And I remember sitting, and there were times where, because I loved preaching, and it was a challenge to just sit. But I think it didn't take long, especially, and I think it's a testimony of how God has blessed us here at RBC, that hearing the different giftings of the men that are here, it began to be very refreshing for my soul. And I realized, I thought that I knew so much about pastoring and church life, and now I felt like I didn't know as much as I thought I did, and that I'm really needing to learn and observe. And it was good for me to be somewhere where I could be a church member and faithfully serve any way that I can.
I think it's hard sometimes for preachers, and I have seen this and witnessed this. And it's caused me to ask questions in my own life, obviously. Do I love the church for the church, or do I love the church because of what I get to do in and for the church? And there's a lot of feedback. There's a lot of, that your average, again, what I mean by that, the man in the pew, woman in the pew doesn't get that the man in the pulpit gets. And a man in the pulpit can sometimes say, I love the church, but they really love the church as long as they're preaching. And they find not only do they lose their identity, but sometimes they lose their zeal for the church. Did you find that you had to regrow a love for the local church? Because anybody who follows you online, it becomes very obvious. You have a love for the local church and a gratitude for the blessings of the Lord's Day. Did that get ingrained in you anew, or was it like, no, this is showing me I'm not just a pastor, I'm a Christian who does love the church, whether I preach or not?
I think it's a combination of the two. I mean, if I'm being quite candid,
No, please do. That's why.
in the first few weeks after I stepped down from the pastorate, I mean, the feelings that I had, there was a part of me that was like, I don't, is this church stuff even worth this?
Yeah.
Is it really worth it? And I think that was one of the great blessings of moving into a new area and coming. And it was a challenge because I mean, where I had pastored was also where I had grown up. And so, I mean, basically, I've only known one church most of my whole life. And it was also scary to walk into a new place where people don't know me,
Right.
and trying to find that balance of wanting to be plugged in, but also fearful of being hurt again.
Right.
And trying to, and so I think, but the longer that I've been here, the more that I can see just how much I love being a part of this local congregation. That even when the Lord's blessed me to have an opportunity to go fill a pulpit somewhere, that I miss being here, and I can tell that this is where my heart is at.
Jake, I don't want to get any detail on this, but leaving ministry was painful.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like, oh, I feel like I'm come to the end, but there was a lot. There was discouragement, church hurt, church pain. How do you feel the Lord's helped you? Do you feel like is it still real tender to the touch, or do you feel like God's helped you to, it's scabbed over to some degree, or do you find that it comes and goes, that some days you can find yourself revisiting that pain, or we talk about moving on.
Sure.
And that I think we like to put things in neat categories. How is that for you?
Sitting here today, almost 4 years later, I can say the Lord has brought a good bit of healing into my life, but there are still moments. I can have a tendency towards introspection and replaying the past. And if I'm not careful, if I linger there too long, there can be some seeds of bitterness that kind of begin to move. But I can also look and say the Lord has helped me tremendously, because I can look back and see the things that, quote unquote, I lost in a sense. But He has used all of that to, I believe, make me more conformed into the image of Christ today, and being here at RBC in Louisville, that if I had not had all those things happen, I wouldn't be here today. And so I think I can truthfully say that the bitter providences, at times, the Lord has brought a joy out of that.
I've said at times, every ministry comes with an expiration date, and sometimes a man doesn't know when it ends. Sometimes he realizes it has to end for a variety of reasons. Sometimes a man recognizes, I just can't pastor anymore. I've gotten to that point. I'm too old. I'm too fragile, with my family or whatever. And he transitions into the life of the body. Sometimes that is at that church. Sometimes that can be really hard to do. But as he does that, I can imagine some difficulty. I've been here sometimes 34 years, and I can imagine to some degree what that could be like, and to sit and observe, participate, hear other men preach week after week after week, to see decisions made in the church that you have you don't have the same part in anymore that you did. You're not leading it, not leading a meeting. The thoughts, I would have said that this way, that's interesting, wonder why they did it that way. You have a different perspective than a lot of the people in the church do, having been a pastor for so long. What's that been like for you? Is it, and you can be honest, to say, like, I really thought you think you're a knucklehead, and you elders, you need to stop and listen to what I have to say. Or has it been like, this is really interesting, or what's that? Walk me through that a little bit.
I remember the first members meeting that I attended here. I was very excited because I was very.
You were the only one,
I was very, because I also just love, Baptist polity and ecclesiology. So I was very curious to see how does RBC function in these meetings. And I remember in that first meeting there was kind of a curveball question that got asked to you during that meeting, and I'm sitting back there, and I had like several trains of thought going. I was like, wow, I wonder how Jim's going to answer this. How would I answer it? Boy, I'm glad I'm not having to answer it. And so I think there are some times where some of the heavier aspects of pastoring, I've always wanted to be the encourager of the men here because I know what it's like.
Yes.
I know what those burdens.
Yeah.
There's so many components that, as you said earlier, unless you have done it, you don't know what it's like. And just for an example, if a church has to discipline a member, everybody feels that.
Right.
But as a pastor, you especially feel it because that responsibility and task that you've been given is far greater and deeper. And so I definitely, I feel like I want to be that person that's not, being the armchair quarterback in a sense, because I know what it's like to get that. And so I want to be the cheerleader instead.
Somebody has said that listening to preaching, if you're a preacher, if it's bad, you want to get up in the pulpit. If it's good, it makes you excited to preach again. What's it been like for you you've preached less, you still preach, but you've obviously preached less in the last 3.5, 4 years than you had for a substantial period of your life. So what's that been like for you? Do you find yourself listening as a preacher? Do you know what I mean when I say that? Yep. And well, how would I have handled that text? And you've occasionally given good feedback and helped me with my outlines.
Well, that's kind of the part. Yeah. So there's a few times where when I'm listening to a sermon, I'll think about. I tried not to listen to it as a preacher. That can be because I don't want to sit there and be like critiquing.
But there can be. I appreciate that because sometimes it's not necessarily critiquing, but it is a way of thinking. Like I have sometimes thought that's not at all how I would have handled that text. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean it wasn't good, but it is interesting.
And especially because I preach through Hebrews, and so you've been in Hebrews, and so there's been interesting times where kind of comparing.
That is not at all what I got.
But no, I've never thought, well, he was really off the wall there. but no, just kind of seeing how we kind of outline things, and I think one thing that I've moved towards is that I think I used to be more on the side of maybe going too deep. Okay. And staying too long on one verse, and kind of being the bigger picture.
Yeah.
I've kind of moved in a little bit.
My earlier ministry, and again, had you continued on, it would have been interesting to see how you would develop. So when I preached through Ephesians, I was at 5 to 6 years that I went through Ephesians, and I did somewhere, I can't remember, but it was somewhere between 180 and 200 sermons in the book of Ephesians. If I preached Ephesians now, it would probably be closer to 40, which for some that's still an awful lot. But tell me about life in the body. I find when I visit another church, I'm able to sense I really enjoy entering into my priestly role with my brothers and sisters. Entering into the life of the body in worship, before worship, after worship. What's that been like, that transition for you?
I think one of the things that really stood out to me, the first Sunday I came here, and it stood out to both my mom and my dad, was the sense of a reverent joy that was here. I mean, it was, there was joy, but there was also the sense of we've come to worship. There was a sobriety and the ability of kind of balance, because you can go to one extreme or the other.
Right.
And I remember when I especially first came here to RBC, the encouragement that I received from some of the older saints here really made an impression and meant a lot to me, because, I was the new guy here, and listening to these brothers and sisters who have been here for many years, seeing their faithfulness, kind of hearing some of their stories, that made a real mark on me about what it meant to be a part of this congregation.
So I want to ask you a final question here, and this is just something I've always been interested in, and I think you might be a really good guy to try to answer this. You walk in for that first time, or you spend a number of weeks. let's see if I can phrase this accurately. I have sometimes hoped that somebody would be able to figure out our theology from what we do. That they would be able to say, whether they knew anything about the confession, anything about Reformed words, that they would think, okay, there's prayer here, there's psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, there's Bible reading, there's prayer, there's the ministry of the word, the celebration of the sacraments, and I could therefore assume that there are Bible verses about, you know what I mean by that, that
Yes.
you can look at it and almost deconstruct it in the right sense back to its constituent parts or to its foundational elements. As you had read and studied the Confession of Faith, and as you were at least bringing your church along in that way, and coming into a church that has sought to practice those things at that point for about 30 years, were there things that stood out to you and you recognized as, oh, that's where this is and that's how this fits in? Or were you thinking, I expected more of this, or I would have thought there would be less of that? Or does that make sense?
Yes, I'll say it was interesting to me. One thing that stood out was the way that on Sunday morning and Sunday night, the time of corporate prayer and the specifics. Oh, because I can't say that other word. My southern tongue won't do it.
That's all
And
right.
so, but the way that we have specific requests and involving the congregation, appointing a man in the congregation to pray for this specific
Yeah.
thing, I always usually tended to associate that more with like a midweek meeting instead of a Sunday gathering. And that really impressed me in that way. But I also I already, from us transitioning to being more confessional, had been about the ordinary means of grace.
Okay.
Simple is not boring.
Right.
Simple is rich, and that carried right over here, and I just saw that exemplified. And then also loving the sequential reading of the Scripture, the New Testament in the morning, the Old Testament in the evening, and just getting what I felt like between either beginning with the Psalms or reading in the morning or night, and then the sermon. We're trying to cover as much of the different genres of the Bible as possible each Sunday. So
Appreciate that. Well, Jake, it's been a joy getting to really even know you a little bit better here through this. We're going to have another conversation or two here. Thank you for tuning in today. God willing, we'll be back next week with a new podcast.